I don't understand, Headmaster Eliot. What have I done wrong?
You challenged my scholarship in the classroom. Ridiculous pup. I explained clearly the criteria that made a work of literature great. You had the presumption to suggest that Stephen King novels should be considered classics.
I see. Did you say these things?
I only suggested that some of the works of Stephen King pursue important themes, just like the classics do. In Misery, for instance, he questions who an artist writes for, himself or his audience, by creating a psychopathic fan who forces him to write a popular novel instead of his more literary ones. She literally tortures him into writing what he does not want to write.
Disgusting pulp fiction.
And I said that just because a writer is popular like King is or writes about graphic violence like King does, that should not exclude him from being a classic writer.
But his works have not withstood the test of time. Of course his works will be ignored in another decade or so. They fail to rise above the popularity which sustains them. They cannot and do not exist without the masses. Classic literature should transcend its context. King thrives, even wallows, in his own popularity, which is a fad.
Interesting. Professor Arnold's historicist theory is clear here. Since King is popular, living, and writes for the masses, it is unlikely, according to historicism, that he should be considered a classic work.
Headmaster, you agree with him?
I agree that Stephen King is not a writer of literature, but he is a popular writer of horror for the masses. I agree that his work is not artistic.
But Professor Eliot.
However, while I agree that his novels are pulp, I do not agree with Professor Arnold's reasons for condemning him.
Now see here. This is not a place for an argument between theories.
Oh, Professor Arnold, I do not mean disrespect. You and I agree on a great deal, but historicism had its day. And it has its flaws. As a modernist, I subscribe to a much more academically rigorous criteria for choosing literature.
Are you saying that my academic credentials are not equal to your own?
In a word, yes. Forgive me, Professor, but this young man, insolent as he may be, has really only challenged some obvious holes in historicist theory. Oh, don't worry, I do mean to correct him, but I will do so with the use of modernism and new criticism. Only these theories can help us better understand what great literature truly is.
I have heard this speech before. You drain the blood out of art. A literary vampire.
Hey! Stephen King writes about literary vampires too.
Shut up.
It's William, isn't it? William, let's begin by suggesting that we must examine literature as we do any other field of modern scholarship objectively, without bias or prejudice. If everyone who liked a book had their own emotional bias, we'd never agree on what was art and what was not art.
But people do have biases.
Yes. This is why the opinions of people who are uneducated can be very dangerous. They are likely to believe or say anything and imagine that it is true. If a layperson believed that gravity did not exist or that birds did not lay eggs, we would not consider his opinion educated. We would simply say he was wrong.
Okay. But literature isn't science.
Isn't it? Why not? If you are saying that we cannot study literature but must simply read it and feel about it, how will we ever decide what is valuable? What is worth preserving? What are the most important ideas of our culture?
By how the great ideas of the literature impassion us.
The greatest literature is not science. It is art. But it is art which we can examine without bias and measure for its effectiveness, just like we do with any experiment in science or with any recipe in a kitchen. Literature is simply more complex than cooking or chemistry, so we often believe that it is impossible to measure.
How can you measure art?
Allow me to continue with the cooking metaphor. Suppose you are creating a new soup. You add 6 or 7 ingredients: onion, broth, tomatoes, salt, oil, and so forth. What happens to the taste when you add paprika? The entire taste of the soup changes, is altered. The tomatoes are altered and so are the onions. The combination taste of the tomatoes and onions is also altered, creating a new taste.
Where are you going with this?
Humor me. My point is that with each added ingredient, the taste of every other ingredient is altered, and so is the entire recipe. Is the addition of a tiny spice worthwhile or not? Like a great chef, a great writer understands the meaningful effect of every image, every word, every nuance, in the artistic form. The entire recipe or poem is constructed with such skill that its meaning, its taste, is flawless, classic.
But Professor, some people have different tastes.
This is true. Some people enjoy lobster thermidor. Others eat White Castle. I think there's a measurable difference between the two, don't you? Stephen King even admits this. He said that he was, quote, the literary equivalent of a Big Mac and fries.
You make a good point. But are you saying that personal taste is irrelevant? Are you saying that a reader's feelings about a poem don't count?
I'm saying that we must use reason to determine the qualitative difference in art. It's not that poems and other art do not create emotion. It's that the emotion is created through the text itself. If we carefully analyze the effects of language, we can uncover the complexity and subtlety of emotions that are objectively within the poem.
Professor Eliot dismisses history. He argues that there is no humanity in art. It is a dangerous idea. By depriving us of the past, we lose our sense of purpose, of what our civilization values.
Absolutely not. What modernists create is a positive spirit of reason and logic, one that refuses to accept the past, tradition, or authority as a reason to call something art. We can determine ourselves, objectively, what art really is. Professor Arnold says that something is a classic because it has withstood the test of time. This traditional, historicist understanding of art relies upon past generations to tell you what is classic. I argue that we can decide for ourselves.
Ah, so I can reason that Stephen King is classic literature.
You can try. You see, Professor Arnold claims that King fails to be art only because he isn't dead. Other writers will spread worthwhile ideas because they already have. King will not because he has not. On the other hand, I say that King fails to be art because his recipe for fiction inevitably fails to impress. Occasionally he provokes an interesting taste, but too often his work is sour, wrongly flavored.
You said earlier that artistic text creates emotion.
Yes.
So King's texts create fear, horror. They create anxiety and hope. The text makes readers uncomfortable.
I have read him. Occasionally he finds powerful images. But here is a quotation from his book Rage. He looked at them, then looked up at me. His face was strange and grief-stunned. It made me uncomfortable. You see, this is like eating a fine soup and discovering a great lump of salt at the bottom. With the worst clumsiness of an amateur, King creates emotions by simply hammering them onto the page, naming them, and even then we don't know what he means exactly.
But other parts of the book are really good.
The point is that there is nothing objectively artistic about his writing. More, there's no complexity to the meaning. I don't mean to say that all art must be complex, but that the human experience is complex and art reflects our experience and humanity. The greatest art is highly complex. It reveals just how difficult it is to articulate who we are, what we think. This is why art requires nuance, just as the taste of a good soup does. This is why a Big Mac and fries are little more than a sugar and salt bomb encased in styrofoam. They are grotesque simplifications of what we are capable. And they often leave us with indigestion.
On these points we are in agreement.
And we agree on another idea, as well. The outside world is often a chaotic mess. We find a McDonald's on every corner and iPods playing the same nasty Beyoncé beats for months on end. Politicians work to fool naive voters who would rather watch The Biggest Loser than read a real economics report. Today Americans hold votes on whether or not they still want to pay for libraries and art museums. Understand this then, art, literature itself creates the highest form of human experience. It is perhaps the only thing which gives our civilization structure, helps us know our full potential.
This is well said, Professor Eliot.
I get it. But here is the difference, I think. Where you say that art creates meaning on its own and provides that meaning to the world, Professor Arnold's historicism says that the world, I mean history, tells us what art is and what it is not.
A gross simplification.
But not entirely wrong, my friend. You find something artistic if history bestows meaning upon it. The modernist, on the other hand, finds meaning only within the text itself. And when it is written well, it works upon all of society.
I've heard enough. Headmaster Eliot, what punishment has this upstart earned?
I find his attitude of curiosity and reflection praiseworthy. Any good theory should be able to withstand some inquiry, don't you think? As for punishment, he has earned extra tutorial time. We will see to his formal education.
Rumph.
Thank you for your kindness, Professor. I was worried you might suspend me.
Nonsense. Instead, I will introduce you to the American version of modernism. It's a philosophy they call the New Criticism. I think you will find it fascinating. Let's go for a short walk.